Kim Jong-un believed his soldiers would return home as heroes after supporting Russia's war machine. However, the frozen battlefields of Kursk Oblast have become a death trap where North Korean troops face annihilation not from Ukrainian forces alone, but from their own Russian commanders who treat them as expendable cannon fodder. Intelligence reports confirmed on March 8, 2026 that approximately 50,000 North Korean soldiers are now effectively stranded in a 400-square-kilometer killing zone, cut off from supply lines, abandoned by their supposed allies, and facing a coordinated Ukrainian offensive that has already eliminated more than 8,000 of their comrades. This is not a routine military deployment gone wrong. This represents the complete collapse of North Korea's first major foreign military intervention in over half a century, and the numbers tell a story of systematic betrayal that will reshape the entire geopolitical landscape of Northeast Asia. The images you are about to see on your screens will fundamentally challenge everything you thought you understood about the Russia-North Korea alliance. What you see is not a partnership between equals, but a calculated exploitation that has turned North Korean soldiers into disposable assets in Russia's desperate attempt to hold Ukrainian territory. The footage shows the terrifying reality of combined arms warfare where technology, intelligence superiority, and tactical brilliance converge to create what military analysts are calling an inescapable strategic trap. But that is not the most shocking detail. There are three interconnected factors that have transformed this North Korean deployment from military operation into humanitarian catastrophe. The first is Ukraine's systematic destruction of every single supply corridor connecting these troops to Russian rear areas. The second is Russia's deliberate decision to position North Korean units in the most exposed frontline sectors without adequate fire support or evacuation routes. The third is China's calculated silence as its nominal ally faces complete military humiliation. We will explain each of these factors in detail as this analysis unfolds. Now let us descend to that critical moment when it all began, to the snow-covered forests along the Russia-Ukraine border in Kursk Oblast. According to reports from the Institute for the Study of War released on February 28, 2026, North Korean forces began their deployment to this sector in late January following secret agreements reached between Pyongyang and Moscow during Kim Jong-un's visit to the Russian Far East. The deployment involved elite units from the Korean People's Army's 11th Corps, soldiers who had trained for years in mountain and winter warfare operations. These were not poorly equipped conscripts, but North Korea's best-trained professional soldiers, men selected specifically for their ideological reliability and combat capabilities. They arrived in Russia carrying expectations of modern equipment integration and coordinated operations with Russian forces. Instead, they found themselves thrust into defensive positions along a 120-kilometer front line that Ukrainian forces had already identified as critically vulnerable. The location you see highlighted on the screen is the Sudzha salient, a bulge of Russian-controlled territory that extends approximately 35 kilometers into Kursk Oblast. Russian military planners positioned North Korean units throughout this salient, particularly concentrated in three key defensive zones near the towns of Koronevo, Glushkovo, and Sudzha itself. The terrain consists of mixed forest and agricultural land with elevation changes that create natural defensive positions but also limit lateral movement and restrict supply route options. Ukrainian intelligence had monitored the North Korean deployment from the beginning through satellite reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and human intelligence networks that penetrated Russian command structures. By early March 2026, Ukrainian military planners had developed a comprehensive strategy to exploit the fundamental weakness of the North Korean deployment, the complete dependence on three primary supply routes that could be systematically severed through precision strike operations. The technical execution of Ukraine's counteroffensive represents a masterclass in modern combined arms warfare that leverages technological superiority against numerically superior but logistically vulnerable forces. Ukraine deployed an integrated strike package consisting of U.S.-supplied ATACMS missiles with ranges exceeding 300 kilometers, Storm Shadow cruise missiles provided by the United Kingdom and France, and domestically produced Neptune cruise missiles modified for ground attack missions. These systems targeted the critical infrastructure nodes that sustained North Korean forces, ammunition depots located near Elgov and Rylsk, fuel storage facilities at Kurchatov, and the three bridge crossings over the Seam River that represented the only viable heavy equipment supply routes into the salient. According to German intelligence reports cited by Der Spiegel on March 5, 2026, the Ukrainian strike campaign achieved devastating precision. The initial salvo launched on March 1 eliminated two of the three primary bridge crossings within a 6-hour window. High-mobility artillery rocket systems, the HIMARS platforms that have become synonymous with Ukrainian long-range strike capability, systematically targeted ammunition storage points, and forward supply dumps. Each HIMARS strike package consists of 6 GPS-guided rockets with accuracy measured in single-digit meters, allowing Ukrainian forces to eliminate specific buildings within larger depot complexes while preserving surrounding infrastructure for later capture. But the truly revolutionary element of this operation involved Ukraine's deployment of AI-enhanced reconnaissance and strike coordination systems. Ukraine integrated data from multiple satellite constellations, NATO reconnaissance aircraft operating in Polish and Romanian airspace, and ground-based intelligence networks to create real-time targeting packages that could identify, verify, and prosecute targets within a 20-minute decision cycle. This represents a fundamental transformation in battlefield tempo that North Korean and Russian forces, still operating with Soviet-era command and control methodologies, simply cannot match. The technical gap is not measured in equipment quality alone, but in the systematic integration of information dominance that allows smaller Ukrainian forces to concentrate combat power at decisive points faster than adversaries can respond. Ukrainian ground forces complemented the strike campaign with aggressive mechanized operations designed to physically sever the remaining supply corridors. The 82nd Air Assault Brigade, equipped with NATO-standard armored personnel carriers and supported by Polish-supplied Krab self-propelled howitzers, executed a rapid thrust toward the town of Glushkovo on March 4. This maneuver succeeded in cutting the final paved road connecting the Sudzha salient to Russian logistics hubs in Kursk city. The advancing Ukrainian forces employed sophisticated electronic warfare systems that jammed Russian communication networks while maintaining their own secure data links through Starlink satellite terminals. Russian commanders attempting to coordinate counterattacks found their radio networks degraded to the point of functional uselessness, forcing reliance on courier systems and unsecured civilian cellular networks that Ukrainian signals intelligence could easily intercept and exploit. This tactical success in severing supply lines translates into operational paralysis that fundamentally alters the strategic balance across the entire Kursk sector. Military logistics experts calculate that a mechanized infantry division requires approximately 200 tons of supplies per day to maintain basic combat operations, with fuel consumption representing roughly 40% of that total and ammunition accounting for another 35%. The 50,000 North Korean soldiers trapped in the salient, organized into approximately 4 division-equivalent formations, require a minimum of 800 tons of daily supply deliveries to maintain defensive operations. With the primary supply routes destroyed and Ukrainian artillery controlling the approaches to the remaining tertiary roads, Russian logistics units can deliver perhaps 150 to 200 tons per day through dangerous nighttime convoy operations that suffer approximately 30% attrition rates from Ukrainian drone and artillery strikes. The mathematics of this supply deficit become brutally simple. North Korean forces are consuming existing stockpiles at a rate that will exhaust ammunition reserves within 10 to 14 days and fuel supplies within 8 to 10 days from the initial supply line severance on March 4. Artillery units have already begun rationing shells, restricting fire missions to only the most critical defensive situations. Armored vehicles remain largely stationary to preserve fuel for potential breakthrough attempts or emergency evacuations. Infantry units face ammunition shortages that force tactical decisions prioritizing defense of the most critical positions while abandoning secondary defensive lines. But this brings us to the most crucial and darkest point in this entire catastrophic deployment. The supply crisis facing North Korean forces represents an entirely predictable outcome that Russian military planners not only anticipated but deliberately engineered as part of a cynical strategy to expend North Korean lives in exchange for temporary tactical breathing space. According to leaked communications intercepted by Ukrainian signals intelligence and shared with Radio Free Europe reporters, Russian commanders explicitly discussed the North Korean deployment as a method to absorb Ukrainian offensive pressure while preserving Russian units for later counteroffensive operations. The term used in these intercepted communications, and this is a direct translation from Russian military jargon, described North Korean soldiers as rashodny material, expendable material, the same terminology Russian logistics officers used to describe artillery shells and rifle ammunition. This calculated cruelty extends beyond mere strategic cynicism into systematic operational decisions that maximize North Korean casualties while minimizing Russian losses. Russian commanders positioned North Korean units in the most exposed defensive sectors, locations where Ukraine Ukrainian forces concentrate their most intensive artillery and drone strikes. Russian artillery support for these positions has been minimal and sporadic, with priority consistently given to supporting Russian units in less threatened sectors. When Ukrainian forces penetrate North Korean defensive lines, Russian doctrine calls for immediate counterattacks to restore the position and rescue surrounded units. These counterattacks have not materialized. North Korean soldiers requesting fire support or evacuation assistance receive vague promises and bureaucratic delays, while Russian units in adjacent sectors receive immediate artillery coverage and armored reinforcements. The human dimension of this betrayal manifests in individual stories that transform abstract strategic analysis into visceral moral outrage. Geolocated footage verified by open-source intelligence analysts shows North Korean soldiers in defensive positions near Koronevo attempting to signal surrender to advancing Ukrainian forces using white flags and raised hands. The footage, filmed by Ukrainian drone operators on March 7th, captures the moment when Russian artillery begins shelling these same positions, apparently attempting to prevent mass surrender that would eliminate an entire defensive sector. The North Korean soldiers, caught between Ukrainian advance and Russian artillery, face an impossible choice between death from Ukrainian assault, death from Russian artillery targeting their own positions, or potential execution for desertion if they successfully retreat to Russian lines. This scene is tragic enough to go down in modern war history as a definitive example of alliance betrayal. An army that traveled thousands of kilometers to support an ally's war effort finds itself deliberately sacrificed by that same ally, treated not as valued partners but as expendable resources to be consumed and discarded. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. North Korean military culture emphasizes absolute loyalty, unquestioning obedience, and collective sacrifice for the greater good of the nation. These soldiers arrived in Russia believing they were fulfilling a sacred duty to support a socialist ally against Western imperialism. They are now learning through brutal experience that their lives hold no value to their Russian partners, that their suffering serves only to delay Ukrainian advances by a few days or weeks before inevitable defeat. The geopolitical implications of this military catastrophe extend far beyond the immediate tactical situation in Kursk Oblast. North Korea's decision to deploy forces to support Russia represented Kim Jong-un's most significant foreign policy gamble since assuming power in 2011. The deployment aimed to achieve multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. First, it sought to demonstrate North Korea's value as a military ally capable of projecting power beyond the Korean peninsula, enhancing Pyongyang's bargaining position with both Russia and China. Second, it created an opportunity to gain access to Russian military technology and combat experience that could inform North Korean force modernization. Third, it generated economic benefits through Russian payments for military services and potential technology transfers. Every single one of these objectives has collapsed into complete failure. Rather than enhancing North Korea's international prestige, the deployment has exposed the Korean People's Army as technologically obsolete and tactically inflexible when facing modern Western military systems. The supposed partnership with Russia has revealed itself as exploitation, where North Korean lives purchased temporary tactical advantages for Russian forces. The economic benefits, initially projected at several $100 million in Russian payments, now appear minuscule compared to the staggering human and material costs of the deployment. China's response to this catastrophe reveals the complex triangular relationship between Beijing, Moscow, and Pyongyang. Chinese state media has maintained almost complete silence regarding the North Korean deployment to Russia, a remarkable omission given China's typically extensive coverage of Korean Peninsula affairs. According to analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies released on March 10, 2026, this silence represents calculated Chinese policy designed to maintain strategic ambiguity while avoiding any commitment to support either North Korea's failing operation or Russia's exploitation of its ally. China faces a fundamental dilemma. Supporting North Korea's deployment would align Beijing with Russian aggression and potentially trigger secondary sanctions from Western nations. Criticizing the deployment would damage relations with both Moscow and Pyongyang while revealing divisions within the supposed anti-Western coalition. Beijing's preferred solution involves allowing the situation to resolve itself through North Korean withdrawal or defeat while maintaining public silence that preserves theoretical solidarity. Chinese diplomats have reportedly conveyed private messages to Pyongyang suggesting that the deployment represents an unnecessary diversion of resources from North Korea's primary security requirements on the Korean peninsula. These messages stop short of explicit demands for withdrawal, but clearly signal Beijing's displeasure with Kim Jong-un's independent military adventurism. The subtext of Chinese policy is unmistakable. North Korea has overextended itself without Chinese approval and must bear the consequences without expectation of Chinese rescue. The strategic humiliation facing Kim Jong-un personally cannot be overstated. North Korean political culture revolves around the cult of personality surrounding the supreme leader, a figure portrayed as infallible strategic genius whose decisions invariably lead to triumph over adversity. The Kursk deployment was personally approved by Kim Jong-un and celebrated in North Korean state media as a historic demonstration of North Korea's emergence as a global military power. Domestic propaganda portrayed the deployment as evidence of the world's recognition of North Korea's military excellence and the wisdom of Juche ideology in creating powerful armed forces. This propaganda narrative now faces collision with brutal reality. The 50,000 stranded soldiers include men from politically connected families, sons of Workers' Party officials, and Korean People's Army officers whose deaths or capture would directly impact the elite circles that sustain Kim Jong-un's rule. The regime has already begun suppressing information about casualties, but news inevitably filters through unofficial channels as families stop receiving letters and military units conduct memorial services for fallen soldiers. The regime can control official narratives but cannot prevent whispered conversations and growing awareness that something has gone catastrophically wrong with the Russian deployment. Kim Jong-un's options for addressing this crisis range from terrible to catastrophic. The least damaging option involves immediate withdrawal of North Korean forces from the Kursk salient, accepting the military and political humiliation of retreat but preserving the lives of surviving soldiers. This option requires Russian cooperation to provide safe passage and logistic support for withdrawal, cooperation that Russian commanders may withhold if they calculate that maintaining North Korean forces in defensive positions even as they face annihilation provides more tactical value than allowing orderly retreat. The withdrawal option also requires Kim Jong-un to publicly acknowledge that the deployment failed, a nearly impossible admission within North Korean political culture where leadership infallibility represents a core ideological principle. The second option involves attempting a military breakthrough to reconnect stranded forces with Russian supply lines. This would require concentrating remaining North Korean mechanized forces and Russian support units for a coordinated assault to punch through Ukrainian encirclement and establish a secure supply corridor. Military analysts assess this option as having less than 15% probability of success given Ukrainian intelligence dominance, artillery superiority, and defensive positions that would channel any breakthrough attempt into prepared kill zones. The attempt would likely result in catastrophic casualties while failing to achieve the objective, worsening rather than resolving the crisis. The third and most desperate option involves accepting that the stranded forces cannot be extracted and attempting to transform the disaster into propaganda victory through narrative manipulation. North Korean state media could portray the soldiers as heroic martyrs who sacrificed themselves to defend socialism against Western aggression, creating a mythology of noble defeat that echoes historical Korean military disasters transformed into stories of moral victory. This narrative approach requires the actual annihilation or capture of the stranded forces, outcomes that would generate thousands of casualties and potentially hundreds of prisoners whose testimonies could undermine regime propaganda. So what happens now? The coming 2 weeks will determine whether this military deployment becomes merely a significant setback for North Korea or transforms into a regime-threatening catastrophe that undermines Kim Jong-un's political legitimacy. Ukrainian forces are methodically tightening the encirclement, establishing multiple defensive lines that prevent breakout attempts while systematically eliminating the remaining North Korean combat power through precision artillery and drone strikes. Russian commanders show no indication of mounting serious relief efforts, apparently content to allow Ukrainian forces to destroy North Korean units while preserving Russian combat strength for operations deemed more strategically important. The international community watches this developing catastrophe with mixture of strategic calculation and moral discomfort. Western intelligence agencies see the North Korean deployment failure as validation of their assessment that the Russia-North Korea-China axis lacks the cohesion and mutual trust necessary for effective military cooperation. The systematic betrayal of North Korean soldiers by Russian commanders demonstrates that authoritarian alliances based on shared opposition to Western power cannot generate the deep partnership required for sustained military operations. This assessment influences Western policy debates about the durability of the anti-Western coalition and the potential for exploiting divisions between Moscow, Beijing, and Pyongyang. But this situation also creates dangerous uncertainty about North Korean responses. A regime facing domestic political pressure from military disaster might attempt to divert attention through provocative actions on the Korean peninsula, creating risks of escalation that could draw in South Korea, Japan, and the United States. Kim Jong-un has historically responded to setbacks with aggressive demonstrations of military capability, including nuclear and missile tests designed to project strength and deterrence. The possibility of North Korea conducting a major weapons test or provocative military exercise in response to the Kursk disaster represents a genuine concern for regional stability. This brings us to perhaps the most profound question raised by this entire catastrophe. What does the systematic betrayal of North Korean soldiers by Russian forces reveal about the true nature of authoritarian military alliances? The answer appears increasingly clear. Authoritarian regimes form partnerships based on shared opposition to perceived threats and tactical convenience rather than genuine ideological alignment or mutual commitment. When these partnerships face genuine stress, when costs must be allocated and sacrifices made, the underlying absence of trust and mutual obligation becomes apparent. Russian commanders treat North Korean soldiers as expendable because Russian strategic culture views alliance relationships through purely transactional lens where loyalty extends only as far as immediate tactical utility. This pattern extends beyond the Russia-North Korea relationship to illuminate broader dynamics within the anti-Western coalition. China's carefully calibrated silence regarding North Korea's disaster reflects Beijing's unwillingness to sacrifice Chinese interests to support either Moscow or Pyongyang when doing so carries significant costs. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization and other institutional frameworks that supposedly unite Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea in opposition to Western power reveal themselves as hollow structures lacking the deep integration and mutual commitment that characterize NATO and other Western alliance systems. The human cost of these geopolitical calculations manifests in the frozen forests of Kursk Oblast, where 50,000 North Korean soldiers face a future measured in days or weeks before ammunition exhaustion forces either surrender or annihilation. These men believed they were serving their nation and supporting a valued ally. They are learning through the most brutal education possible that authoritarian promises of solidarity and mutual support dissolve when tested by genuine adversity. The international order is witnessing in real time the fundamental fragility of alliances built on shared grievance rather than shared values. The images you are seeing on your screens of defensive positions being systematically eliminated, of supply convoys destroyed before reaching their destinations, of soldiers facing impossible tactical situations with inadequate support, these images will define this moment in military history. This is not just another tactical setback in Russia's war against Ukraine. This represents a fundamental exposure of the weaknesses inherent in authoritarian alliance systems, weaknesses that will shape great power competition for years to come. Only time will tell whether Kim Jong-un can navigate the domestic political consequences of this catastrophe or whether the Kursk disaster becomes the beginning of a broader crisis of legitimacy for the North Korean regime. What we can say with certainty is that the next generation of North Korean military officers will remember how their Russian allies treated Korean soldiers as expendable cannon fodder, and that memory will influence North Korean strategic calculations long after the last soldier evacuates or surrenders in Kursk Oblast. The fire that started in these frozen forests may spread far beyond this immediate battlefield, igniting questions about alliance reliability and regime competence that authoritarian systems struggle to answer without acknowledging uncomfortable truths. So here is the question we must all consider as this situation develops. Do you think North Korea will withdraw its forces and accept the humiliation, or will Kim Jong-un double down on this failing operation to avoid admitting defeat? The coming days will provide the answer, but the strategic implications will echo for decades across Northeast Asia and the broader international system. Kim Jong-un sent his soldiers to Russia believing they would demonstrate North Korean military power and strengthen alliance relationships. Instead, those soldiers face abandonment in a killing zone where their supposed allies have deliberately sacrificed them for minimal tactical gain. The supreme leader who cannot admit mistakes now confronts a disaster of his own making, a crisis that exposes both the weakness of his military and the hollowness of his international partnerships. This is the reality behind the propaganda, the truth that state-controlled media in Pyongyang will desperately attempt to conceal but cannot ultimately suppress. Don't forget to share your thoughts on this developing situation in the comments section. Will North Korea's military disaster in Kursk fundamentally reshape the geopolitics of Northeast Asia, or will the regime successfully suppress information and maintain domestic stability despite this catastrophic failure? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like our video to stay informed as this crisis continues to unfold. The 50,000 North Korean soldiers who crossed into Russia expecting to serve as valued allies now find themselves stranded and abandoned, treated as disposable assets in a cynical strategic calculation. Kim Jong-un gambled his nation's military credibility and the lives of his best soldiers on a partnership that has revealed itself as exploitation. The winter cold in Kursk Oblast will claim many of these soldiers, but the cold calculation that sacrificed them will chill relations between Pyongyang and Moscow for a generation. Presented by TGN, thank you for choosing us.